A black teen being unfairly harassed by a local cop. The heir, once used to the comforts of wealth, faces a choice: stay silent or take a stand against blatant injustice. What follows is a tense confrontation where the cop unknowingly steps into a situation that will flip his world upside down. The ending? You won't see it coming. Before starting, quickly comment from where in the world you are listening to this story. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon. The sun was lazily sinking below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the city as people strolled through the streets, caught in the typical weekend days. Suddenly, a blaring siren shattered the peace. The shrill sound cut through the air like a blade, drawing the attention of pedestrians. Some paused, while others quickened their pace, not wanting to get involved in whatever trouble had suddenly appeared. A cop car sped down the street, tires screeching as it abruptly came to a stop on a quiet corner. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the scene in rapid pulses, like a warning. Something wasn't right. Something was very wrong. The officer, a man with a stocky build and hard-set eyes, stepped out of the vehicle with purpose. His jaw was clenched, and his movements were sharp, like a predator closing in on its prey. But his target was no hardened criminal. Standing under the suffocating glow of the police car's headlights was a lone black teen, no older than 16 or 17. He had a skateboard slung over his shoulder, his youthful face frozen in a mix of confusion and fear. His body tensed as if trying to make sense of what was happening, like a deer caught in the path of an oncoming car. "Hey! Hands where I can see them!" The officer's voice barked through the night, rough and authoritative. The demand was clear, and the teen, wide-eyed and trembling, slowly raised his hands in the air. His skateboard clattered to the ground with a hollow thud, forgotten in the heat of the moment. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the chill of the evening seemed to close in on him. A few feet away, unnoticed by the officer, Leo Montgomery watched in disbelief. The young man, in his mid-20s, had been out for a casual walk, taking in the sights of the city and mulling over the weight of his future. As the heir to the vast Montgomery family fortune, Leo had been raised in privilege, shielded from the harsher realities of life that most people endured. His life had been one of luxury, charity galas, and elite boarding schools. He had never known hunger, never known real fear. But tonight, he was seeing something different. Something he couldn't ignore. The scene unfolding in front of him twisted his gut. There was something unmistakable in the officer's behavior, the way he had targeted the teen, the aggression in his voice. Leo knew what this was. It was an all-too-common occurrence that he'd only ever read about or seen on the news. But now, it was happening right in front of him, and he was a witness. "What's going on here?" Leo's voice rang out before he could stop himself. His feet moved almost on their own as he stepped closer to the confrontation, heart pounding in his chest. The cop whipped his head toward Leo, annoyance flashing in his eyes. He clearly wasn't used to being questioned. "Mind your business." "This kid looks suspicious," he growled, his hand resting on his belt as though daring Leo to challenge him further. The teen, his voice barely a whisper, tried to explain. "I was just skating home, sir. I didn't do anything." He was clearly scared, his voice wavering under the weight of the situation. "That so?" The officer's sneer was evident in his tone as he jabbed a finger toward a storefront a block away. "And you just happened to be near that broken window over there?" Leo's eyes darted toward the direction the officer had pointed. Sure enough, there was a shattered window across the street, but the teen wasn't anywhere near it when Leo had arrived. The cop's assumption was painfully clear, and it made Leo's blood boil. It was as if the kid's skin color alone had been enough to make him guilty in the cop's eyes. For a moment, Leo was frozen in place, his mind racing. This wasn't his world. He had lived in a bubble of wealth and privilege his entire life. But something inside him, something deeply buried, stirred to life. He could feel it, a sense of justice, of right and wrong. He wasn't going to stand by and let this happen. He clenched his fists, stepping further into the scene. "Look, I saw the whole thing," Leo said, his voice stronger than he expected. "He didn't do anything wrong." The cop scoffed, turning his full attention to Leo now. His expression shifted from one of suspicion to irritation. "You think you can play hero, here? Step aside, kid." This isn't some social media moment. Leo's jaw tightened. He wasn't some kid, and this wasn't about playing hero. His entire life, he had watched his father negotiate deals with ruthless businessmen, watching as power dynamics played out in boardrooms. But this? This was something else entirely. This was real life, and the stakes were far higher. He wasn't about to back down. You're harassing him because he's black. We both know it, Leo said, his voice low but firm, his eyes locked on the officer's. The tension in the air thickened. The officer's face turned a shade of red that could have matched the flashing lights of his car. He stepped closer to Leo, their faces inches apart, his breath hot with anger. You better back off before I arrest you for obstruction, the cop warned, his voice dripping with menace. Leo's heart pounded in his chest, each beat loud and heavy. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins. Years of living in a world where power was everything had trained him to handle pressure, to maintain a calm exterior. But this situation, this moment, was different. It was far more intense than anything he had ever experienced in the safety of a boardroom. But if there was one thing Leo had learned from his father, it was how to stand his ground. You're making a mistake, Leo said quietly, his voice unwavering despite the adrenaline coursing through his body. And you have no idea who you're dealing with. The cop narrowed his eyes, clearly unamused. He leaned in closer, a mocking smile curling at the corners of his lips. Oh yeah? Who are you supposed to be? Some rich punk with daddy's money? Leo's lips slowly curved into a confident grin. He had been underestimated before, many times, but this was different. He wasn't just some spoiled rich kid. He had power, real power, and now, it was time to use it. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone, holding it up for the officer to see. You've heard of Montgomery Enterprises, right? Leo asked, watching the officer's expression carefully. The cop's eyes flickered for a moment, the name clearly registering with him. There was a brief flash of recognition, but he tried to shrug it off. What of it? He muttered, though his bravado had taken a noticeable hit. Leo's grin widened. He knew he had him. Well, he continued, holding up his phone, I'm Leo Montgomery. You know, the guy whose family just donated a hefty sum to the mayor's re-election campaign. Leo paused for a beat, letting the weight of his words sink in. And the mayor happens to be on my speed dial. For a split second, there was silence. The color drained from the cop's face as he processed what Leo had just said. The arrogance, the bravado, it all seemed to evaporate in an instant. Leo raised his phone to his ear, his finger hovering over the screen. Maybe I should give him a call? Let him know how one of his officers is handling things down here on the street. The cop stammered, visibly shaken now. The air of authority he had held moments ago was slipping from his grasp, and he knew it. There's no need for that, Mr. Montgomery. I was just... No, Leo cut him off, his voice icy. You were just profiling an innocent kid, and now you're in hot water. You need to let him go. The officer swallowed hard, his posture deflating as he realized just how far out of his depth he was. He waved his hand dismissively, a weak gesture that lacked the confidence he'd shown earlier. Fine. He's free to go. The tension between Leo and the officer lingered in the air like a storm cloud, charged and ready to explode. Leo's phone was still in his hand, the cop's face drained of color. Moments ago, he had been in control, wielding his badge like a weapon, but now? Now the tables had turned. Leo's cool confidence, bolstered by his family's power and influence, had shattered the officer's bravado. The teen, standing off to the side, his hands still raised, seemed frozen in disbelief, his eyes darting between Leo and the cop, unsure of what would happen next. Leo's gaze never wavered, his voice steady and calm, but carrying a weight that left no room for argument. You've got a lot to think about, Leo said, his tone sharp enough to cut through the night air. Next time you throw your weight around like this, remember, you might not always get so lucky as to run into someone with connections. The officer swallowed hard, his eyes flickering with resentment, but he knew he was outmatched. This wasn't just about one kid on the street anymore. This was about his career, his livelihood, and maybe even his future. Without another word, he turned on his heel and retreated to his car. The once dominant figure now moved like a man defeated. He climbed into the driver's seat, his movement stiff, and pulled away without so much as a glance back. The flashing lights disappeared into the distance, and the hum of the engine faded into the background. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sounds of the city continuing around them. The pedestrians who had stopped to watch the scene slowly resumed their walks, some of them whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. A few glanced at Leo, curious and perhaps a little in awe of what had just happened. Leo turned to face the teen, who was still standing there, wide-eyed, as if the world had come to a standstill. The relief was evident on the young man's face, but so was the shock. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if they were both trying to process what had just transpired. "Thanks, man," the teen finally whispered, his voice shaky, but filled with gratitude. I don't even know what to say. Why'd you help me?" Leo smiled faintly, his expression softening. This was a side of life he rarely saw, a side of life that people like him, people born into wealth and privilege, often ignored. But he couldn't look away, not now, not after this. "Because someone had to," Leo replied, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. He glanced down at the phone in his hand, the screen still lit up. "And because it's time people like me start doing more than just writing checks." The teen blinked, as if trying to wrap his mind around what Leo had said. "But, you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to get involved." Leo chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "Maybe not, but it was the right thing to do. It doesn't matter where I come from or what I have. What matters is doing what's right, and standing up for people who can't always stand up for themselves." The teen nodded, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since the confrontation began. He seemed to be regaining his composure, though his eyes still held a glint of disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you." Leo waved a hand, brushing off the gratitude with a smile. "You don't have to thank me. Just take care of yourself, okay?" Before the teen could respond, the soft hum of an approaching engine reached their ears. A sleek black SUV rolled up to the curb, its dark windows giving no hint of the person inside. The vehicle was spotless, reflecting the streetlights in a way that made it seem almost like a shadow, a phantom of the night. It came to a smooth stop, and the passenger window rolled down with a quiet whir. Sitting in the front seat was an older man, dressed in an immaculate suit that looked like it had been tailored by one of the best designers in the city. His graying hair was slicked back, his sharp features set in an expression of polite indifference. He glanced at Leo, his face betraying no surprise, but there was a knowing look in his eyes, as if he had expected this all along. "Young Master Montgomery," the man said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Your father is waiting for you at the charity gala. Are you ready to head out?" Leo glanced at the teen, then back at the driver. The charity gala. He had almost forgotten. Tonight was supposed to be another evening of formalities and small talk, rubbing shoulders with the city's elite, smiling for the cameras, and playing the part of the dutiful heir. But after what had just happened, the idea of spending the evening in a ballroom, surrounded by people who had no idea what was really happening in the world, felt wrong. Leo shook his head, his decision already made. "Actually, I think I'm going to skip the gala tonight. Let them know I've got more important things to handle." The driver's brow furrowed in confusion, but he quickly masked it with a nod of acceptance. "Very well, sir," he said, pulling the SUV to a stop by the curb. Leo turned to the teen one last time, his expression soft but determined. "Come on," he said, motioning toward the SUV. "I'll get you a ride home." The teen blinked in surprise, his brow furrowing. "You sure? I mean, you don't have to do that." Leo grinned, the weight of the evening beginning to lift from his shoulders. "You've had a rough night. Least I can do is make sure you get home safe." The teen hesitated for a moment, still unsure of how to respond to the generosity he was being offered. But eventually, he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. Together, they climbed into the back of the SUV, the plush leather seats offering a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the air moments earlier. The driver pulled away from the curb, and as the vehicle glided through the streets, the city outside the windows began to fade into the distance. But the memory of what had just happened lingered in the air, thick and heavy. Leo glanced at the teen, who was staring out the window, his expression thoughtful. The events of the night had changed something in both of them. Leo knew this wasn't the last time he would have to stand up for someone. There would be more moments like this, more times when he would be called to act, to use his power for something greater than just maintaining his status. And somewhere, out there in the city, the cop was sitting in his squad car, realizing just how badly he had underestimated the young heir he tried to intimidate. As the sleek black SUV wove its way through the city streets, Leo sat back, his thoughts swirling like the lights outside the window. The city felt different now, harsher, more vivid. He wasn't the same Leo Montgomery who had casually left his penthouse apartment earlier that evening. Something had shifted inside him, and he knew it was a change he couldn't ignore. Leo glanced over at the teen sitting beside him. He looked calmer now, the initial shock of the encounter fading, but there was still a weight in his eyes, a heaviness that came from knowing the world wasn't always kind, especially to people who looked like him. Leo's heart ached for him, and for all the others who faced this kind of treatment every day. But what was worse, Leo thought, was that he had lived most of his life oblivious to it. His world was one of champagne toasts, power lunches, and boardroom negotiations. The Montgomery family empire stretched far and wide, influencing everything from real estate to politics. And yet, for all their wealth and power, they had remained insulated from the struggles that so many others faced. The charity galas, the donations, they were all just band-aids on a system that was fundamentally broken. Leo stared at his phone, the image of the mayor's contact still glowing on the screen. His family's influence had gotten him out of trouble tonight, but what about the next time? What about the people who didn't have a powerful last name to back them up? The SUV came to a slow stop in front of a modest apartment building on the edge of the city. The driver glanced back in the rearview mirror, awaiting further instructions. Leo turned to the teen, giving him a reassuring nod. "This your stop?" Leo asked. The teen nodded, reaching for the door handle. But before he stepped out, he paused, looking at Leo with a mix of gratitude and something else, something deeper. "Thanks again," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You really didn't have to do any of this." Leo smiled, his expression soft. "I know. But like I said, it's time I start doing more. Just stay safe, okay?" The teen nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You too, man. You too." With that, he stepped out of the SUV and disappeared into the night, leaving Leo alone with his thoughts once more. The city outside the window blurred as the driver pulled away from the curb, heading back toward the heart of downtown. But Leo's mind was elsewhere. For the first time in his life, Leo Montgomery felt like he had found a purpose. It wasn't about maintaining the family empire or impressing the city's elite. It was about something far greater. It was about using his power, his influence, and his privilege to make real change, to stand up for those who couldn't always stand up for themselves. And with that realization, Leo knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning.